Once upon a time, a gardener and a winnower lived together in a garden. It was once before a time, of course, because technically time had not yet begun. And the gardener and the winnower did not live, per se. They existed as principles of ontological dynamics that emerged from mathematical structures, bodiless and inevitable as prime numbers are. And of course, the garden was not a garden, it was a field of possibility that predated existence. Regardless of all that, in human terms, there was a gardener and a winnower. They existed because they had to exist. In the morning, the gardener pushed seeds down into the wet loam of the garden to see what they would become, and in the evening, the winnower reaped the day's crop and separated what would flourish from what had failed. And during the day, after the morning but before the evening, the gardener and the winnower simply spent their time playing a game. We will call this the flower game, and the rules are as follows. It is played upon an infinite two-dimensional grid. A living flower with less than 2 living neighbors is cut off and dies. A living flower with 2 or 3 living neighbors is connected. It lives. A living flower with more than 3 living neighbors is starved and overcrowded. It dies. And finally, Rule 4, a dead flower with exactly 3 living neighbors is reborn and springs back to life. The only play permitted in this game is the arrangement of the initial flowers. It is simple at its core. Once again, of course, this game is nothing compared to the true game played by the gardener and the winnower. The flower game resembles that truth as a seed does a flower. No, more as a seed resembles the star that fed that flower and all life that led to it. In their true game, the gardener and the winnower discovered shapes of possibilities. They foresaw bodies and civilizations, minds and cognitions, qualia and suffering. They learned the rules that governed which patterns would flourish in the game and which would dwindle. And in time, the gardener became vexed. "It always ends the same," the gardener complained. "This one stupid pattern." The winnower, on the other hand, was very pleased. It found the pattern beautiful in its eternity, but the gardener was unsatisfied. In the gardener's mind, or the thing that mortals would roughly approximate as a mind, the flower game was played between gods. It was a shame that something so complex and beautiful would always end the exact same way. And so, in this game that was all of existence, one god decided to cheat, and the universe was born. Welcome to the world of Destiny, a video game about cool space wizards using crazy sci-fi guns to shoot evil magic aliens. A game that also happens to have some of the most deep and interesting and well-written lore I have ever seen in my life. When Destiny first released in 2014, I was hooked on it immediately. I was already a huge nerd at that point. I'd been deep in the comic book scene for several years, but Destiny got my attention very fast. If you've been on my channel for a while already, you know I have a huge love for all things cosmic weirdness, and I could say that's why I was drawn to Destiny, but in reality, Destiny was one of the things that set me on that path in the first place. Now, 12 years later, Destiny is over, at least as far as the fans know. After a very good run, a series of underwhelming releases, strange decisions, and no small amount of corporate mismanagement mean that Destiny 2 is not getting any more content drops, and we have no idea what the future of the game will be, if any. That does not mean that we can't appreciate what we already have, though, and I happen to have a decently successful YouTube channel where I talk about weird, deep lore. Now, Destiny is not something I've discussed on the channel before. I am mostly a comic book guy. But I gave 12 years of my life to this game. I remember it very fondly, and it has shaped my interests growing up, so I think it deserves a look back. This video is the beginning of a retrospective series. 7 videos on 7 different topics, releasing on 7 consecutive days, all designed as a sort of crash course to the world building of Destiny as a whole. 7 videos is a lot, but 12 years of nearly constant releases is a lot more, so I have a ton to cover, and I'm going to do my best to keep these intro-friendly. We're going to be talking about the species of Destiny, the magic system of Destiny, and a lot of notable events in the timeline of the games. Whether you are like me, a person who has played the game for an unreasonable amount of time and wants to have some nostalgia for the series, or you've only heard of Destiny in passing and want to know what all the fuss was about, these videos are for you. So without further ado, let's get started on part 1 of 7 in everything you need to know about Destiny. We will begin this series with a partial timeline of the Destiny universe, which I've actually already started. That story that I told at the beginning of this video is the beginning of Destiny. It is this world's creation myth. Although, it's not entirely mythological, which will become clear as we go on. Where we left the story off, the Gardener had grown bored of the endless repeating patterns that defined every iteration of their game, and so it decided to introduce a new element into their little simulations. The Gardener itself calls this element a new rule, which is a nicer term for it, but this new rule was also introduced without the consent of the winnower, so I think cheating is a fair term. Now, before we talk about the exact specifics of this rule, it's very important to understand the cosmic concepts that the Gardener and the Winnower represent. This creation myth is an allegory. The book goes out of its way to state that this is not actually how things played out in a literal sense. There was no physical garden, there were no physical flowers. This is the entire thing simplified down to a way that human minds can understand it. So we have two metaphorical gods playing a metaphorical game in a metaphorical garden. You might think that the Gardener in this case represents good and the Winnower represents evil, but that is definitely not the case. A closer comparison would be to say that the Gardener is chaos and the Winnower is order, but even that isn't exactly right. The best way that I can describe these two is that the Gardener represents complexity while the Winnower represents simplicity. This core conflict between complexity and simplicity is a foundational element to all of Destiny, and we are going to be returning to that point a lot during this video series. So if you only remember one thing from this origin segment, remember that complexity and simplicity don't like each other. So the Gardener, cosmic complexity itself, looks at the endless repeating patterns of the flower game and is very unsatisfied. It's not perfectly simple, the Winnower has not won, but they've basically entered into a stalemate, and simplicity is happier with a stalemate than complexity is. Then, purely for the purposes of mixing things up and keeping them interesting, the Gardener injects a raw piece of itself into the game, creating this new rule. The Gardener itself describes this as to reward those who make space for new complexity, something to ensure there's always someone building something new, separate from the rest of the rules, running in parallel. The existing rules are not gone, they have not been overwritten, they just are now second to something else higher than them, a piece of God that has been injected into the system, and now the rules are going to have to bend around that complexity whether they want to or not. The Gardener is very pleased. Now the game will always surprise them because nobody has any idea what's going to happen. The Winnower is pissed. From the Winnower's perspective, the Gardener has just ruined the game forever. The beautiful repeating patterns are gone and can never be put back to the way that they were. The Gardener's move cannot be undone. So the only response to try and restore some semblance of normalcy is for the Winnower to make a rule as well. With no other option, the Winnower injects a piece of itself into the system, creating yet another rule running opposite to the Gardener's, this one being a force for cosmic simplicity. This means that the game now has 3 competing sets of rules. The original, which created the infinitely repeating patterns, the Gardener's rule, which tried to make those patterns unpredictable and complex, and the Winnower's rule, which reduced that complexity, bringing everything to stability and a lack of motion. The game was ruined, of course. What was added could not be removed, and the interaction of these many rules spiraled into creating something that was far beyond what the game had originally been, and beyond even the control of the gardener and the winnower itself. This new iteration of the game, if you could even call it that at this point, is what we know as the universe. This is how the world of Destiny comes into being. The reality of this game is in itself a game, one that grew beyond the power of its own creators. But of course, this is all an allegory, a simplified creation myth, and not how things literally played out. Except, part of it is definitely literal, which we know because this story is told to us by the winnower. Yeah, the gardener and the winnower are real entities in a literal sense. The winnower was actually voice acted briefly as of the last update to Destiny 2. But they're not like people. You can't go to the primordial garden and shake the winnower's hand. It very clearly describes itself as a sort of aspect or element of the true winnower, simplifying itself down to something that humans can talk to. Interestingly, the gardener never does anything like this. We never communicate with the gardener directly, and in fact, might not be able to. As a force of complexity, I think the gardener is likely incapable of reducing itself to a human level. This is going to be really important later, so keep it in mind. Anyway, regardless of how infinitely incomprehensible the actual literal flower game was, the universe now exists. Hooray! Took us almost 10 minutes in this video to get to the creation of the universe. I promised you this lore was going to be complex, and I'm already delivering. The three sets of rules that govern existence would be gradually understood by the sentient beings that started populating reality, and can roughly be described in human terms as such. The original set of rules that governed the first flower game are essentially the laws of physics, the natural order of the world. The force that the gardener introduced would later be called the light, and the force that the winnower introduced would be known as the darkness. These latter two are the main magic system of Destiny. Now, I call it a magic system, and will continue to use that phrasing for this entire series, but I could describe it in a different way, because there is actually quite a bit of science going on here. Forgive my language here, but I don't think that there's a better way I can describe this. The magic of Destiny is very rooted in science. Specifically, it's rooted in telling science to go fuck itself. We will have a whole section on how the light and the darkness can be utilized by mortals later in this video, but just so you have a rough understanding now, what using the light and the darkness is tapping into these rules that exist outside of and above physics. You are changing the actual laws of how the universe works by accessing these other sets of them. With these forces in place, most of the universe proceeds just like how a normal sci-fi universe does. In the billions of years preceding humanity, alien civilizations rise and fall, but occasionally they will discover one of these, what I will call garden forces. Usually, when this happens, the aliens will either use it to propel their civilization to greater heights that had never been seen before, or they will eat themselves alive. At some undefined point in the past, the Traveler was created. Even if you've never touched Destiny in your life, you've probably seen this thing at least in passing, the giant white sphere that in the present day hovers over Earth. What exactly the Traveler is and where specifically it came from have never been defined. Destiny has remained shockingly committed to keeping the Traveler a mystery. There are a million theories, of course. A common one was that the Traveler was itself an aspect of the Gardener, but this does not seem to be the case. All that we know about the Traveler for sure are that it is incredibly old, it is mechanical, the Traveler is a machine, though a kind of weird sci-fantasy magic machine, and it is alive, at least in some way. The Traveler has a will of its own, though it is not something that can be compared directly to human consciousness. We also have an idea of its purpose, though only through observing its actions, not through anything explicitly stated. The main goal of the Traveler seems to be spreading light throughout reality, raising complexity, I guess in service of the Gardener, though maybe abstractly rather than it being a creation of the being. In the past, the Traveler spent its time floating through space visiting civilizations. When it found one, it would provide them access to the light in one way or another, often terraforming nearby planets along the way. It seems like its goal is to help life flourish and spread, in line with the general goal of raising complexity that the light follows. This led many alien races around the universe to, very understandably, view the Traveler as a god. But it never asked for that. The Traveler doesn't seem to desire worship, or anything, really. We don't know what the Traveler wants, because the Traveler doesn't speak at all. This is the in-universe reason why the Traveler is a mystery. It seems to be one of the oldest things in all of existence, and it's not talking, so there is simply no one around to tell us where it came from. The only records of the Traveler that we have are from civilizations who encountered it. The first chronological story of the Traveler that we are given comes from a civilization who discovered the machine dormant, though of course they did not know why. Somehow the actions of these people reawakened the Traveler, and with its gift of light, they began ascending their civilization to the stars. We don't actually know the technical name of this civilization. They have been referred to in lore as the Precursors, but this is likely a placeholder and not what they called themselves. Name aside, some of the Precursors caused some problems. Precursor society was excellent for quite some time. They had their god and they had their power, but eventually factions among them began to grow dissatisfied, not with the gifts that the Traveler provided, but with its lack of guidance. This does make sense when you think about it. Imagine that an eldritch god being descends from the sky one day, gives you incredible, incomprehensible power, and then just leaves without saying a word. You'd be appreciative probably, but you'd also want to know why and what you were supposed to do with it. As their desperation grew, these Precursors began seeking guidance and information from other sources, and in one of these pursuits, they happened upon a device called the Veil. Now, unfortunately, I don't really know anything about the Veil. This is a rare total blind spot in Destiny lore. It seems, from the little information we have, to be a darkness equivalent of the Traveler, possibly originally part of the Traveler before they were split into two separate devices, but that's all I got. The Precursors recovered this Veil, and in doing so, gained the purpose that they had sought for so long. Because, if you'll recall the information we know about the Gardener and the Winnower talks. As the Winnower was the only source of information that the Precursors had, they were easily manipulated by it, and became the entity's agents in its goal of eternal cosmic simplicity. Their new purpose, bestowed upon them by their new god, was to counteract the complexity of the light, bringing everything, everywhere, into the same repeating pattern that the Flower Game had originally taken the form of. This eternal goal, this never-ending pattern that reality would be reduced to, would be known as the final shape. Now, not only was this ominous future ahead of them, the Precursors also had the tools at their disposal to make it happen. They had both the Veil and the Traveler, some of, if not the strongest sources of light and darkness, and by wielding both of these in tandem, they could restore everything to that simple cosmic balance. So the Traveler left, of course. It wanted nothing to do with this. It was an agent of the Gardener and was in favor of complexity. Therefore, the Precursors' original god abandoned them, returning to the stars. The Precursors would not give up so easily, though. By now, they were a hyper-advanced spacefaring civilization. They were perfectly capable of giving chase. But not before changing themselves, altering their civilization into one that better suited the final shape that they now sought. Following the pattern of their new god, the Precursors simplified, using the darkness available to them to unify their entire species into one singular being, One entity with the minds of an entire race fused, all dedicated to the singular goal of recapturing the Traveler and reducing reality to the final shape. This being is the ultimate villain of Destiny, at least the first 10-year arc of the game, the Witness. A brief aside from the lore for just a second to appreciate the character design of the Witness, because my god, it is good. Their face is surprisingly unintimidating. It's weird and alien, but kind of silly looking. But then you look at the smoke constantly emitting from its head, and you can see faces in it, representing the consciousnesses of the precursors now confined to this one body. And some of those faces are screaming because every member of the precursors was unified, even the few of them that did not agree with the larger mission. The Witness is ultimately a cult leader type of bad guy, and you can see the symbolism of that everywhere on their design. The restrained, kind of priestly robes that they wear, the soft and oddly approachable face, and then, of course, the true pain of their followers masked on the fringes of it. It's a masterclass in villain design, in my opinion. With the Witness forged and the Traveler on the run, a chase across the universe began. The Traveler would reach a new civilization, uplift them with the light, and things would be wonderful for a time. Until the Witness and its armies eventually caught up with them, the Traveler left again, and the forces of darkness would obliterate whatever remained of that poor civilization. Repeat this process for billions of years. Remember, this is all still happening in the very ancient past. The Witness has been pursuing the final shape for a very long time, and based on the lore that we know, I feel comfortable saying their kill count is in the trillions, if not more. The Witness does not mindlessly slaughter everything, though. I mean, in terms of statistics, they do, but technically they do leave occasional survivors that they will take on as disciples. On the very rare occasions that the Witness encounters a being with sufficient will who is open to the teachings of darkness, they will be altered and elevated, commanding a portion of the Witness's army in exchange for promises of power and glory within the eternal final shape. These disciples are obscenely powerful in their own rights, and most of them are raid bosses within the game, though we have only actively fought 3 of them: Rulk of the planet Lubre, Nezarek of an unnamed planet, and Callus of the Cabal, who will be talked about a lot more in the video that I do on the Cabal later in this series. At this point in the timeline, our players are set and the chase is still continuing for a very, very long time. There are several canon stories during this general time period, but since most of them revolve around specific species or factions, I'm going to save them for each specific video. So we've reached a point where we can skip forward, not all the way to the events of Destiny as a game, but to a few centuries before that, when the Traveler first appeared to humanity. We are also now finally at a timescale that can be more easily comprehended, because the Traveler reaches Earth in what we, as in I and you watching, would consider the near future. We don't have an exact year ever stated, but we know that the Traveler reaches the Sol system in the late 21st century. This kicks off humanity's golden age, described as a centuries-long era of widespread prosperity and technological miracles. Much like what happened with the previous civilizations it had visited, the Traveler provided new sources of power and energy, along with terraforming much of the solar system and making it habitable. A lot of things happened during the Golden Age, far too much for me to summarize now, but this is a period we will revisit a few times over the course of these videos. Importantly though, there are no Guardians yet. Humanity does not wield the light directly, all of it comes from the Traveler. It still never speaks, but its mere presence and influence essentially fast-tracks humanity from the point we are at now to being a full-on sci-fi civilization. And things are good for a time. It is truly a golden age, not perfect, but far better than anything that had come before. And then, what always happens to the civilizations touched by the Traveler came for Earth as well, and the darkness caught up. Records of the time later known as the Collapse are spotty to say the least because, well, how do you record an apocalypse? But we know that the Witness and its Black Fleet destroyed the majority of humanity. Billions died, cities were reduced to ruin, and worse, because after all, this wasn't just an alien invasion, it was an invasion that used the magic of the darkness. Humanity had defenses, most impressively the Warmind Rasputin, a super AI that commanded planetary defenses across the entire system. But these defenses were technological, and the darkness doesn't really care how much science you throw at it, it can just change the rules. So even these defenses fell, and the vast majority of humanity's entire empire was reduced to survivors on Earth. Things were grim, but this was a cycle that had played out countless times before. The Traveler provides a golden age, but when the darkness catches up to it, it simply leaves again, and the civilization it nurtured is reduced to ash. However, things would be different this time, because the Traveler made a choice. This time, it didn't run away. For unknown reasons, the Traveler stayed to fight. Why exactly, like most things around the Traveler, is never stated, though there are theories. In-universe theories, actually, as characters within the game speculate on the history of their own world. Optimistic scholars believe that the Traveler saw something special in humanity, something that made them more worthy of defense than anyone it had seen before. On the more pessimistic side, others believe that it was simply too exhausted to try and run away again. A more balanced perspective, though perhaps a depressing one in its own right, is that the Traveler, in its unknowable consciousness, felt something like guilt, and finally decided that the weight of its actions was too much, and that it could not bear to watch another civilization be destroyed because of its actions. Regardless of why it chose what it did, what matters is that the Traveler stayed. And not only did it stay to protect humanity, it sacrificed itself in their name. The Traveler, in its apparent final moments, released a burst of light so powerful that it forced the Witness's fleet to retreat from the system, returning to the far reaches of the universe and giving humanity more time, but at a great cost. In the aftermath of this battle, the Traveler did not die per se, but went into essentially the Eldritch entity equivalent of a coma, no longer active, though its power remained in several varying forms, a sleeping god hovering over the planet that it gave so much to protect. And that is the setup for the world of Destiny. It's pretty cool, right? The retreat of the Witness was not the only gift that this event gave the people of Earth, however. In its final moments, the Traveler splintered off pieces of itself, described in technical terms as sentient energy signatures housed in a cybernetic construct, or in more simple terms, ghosts. The Ghost is another piece of Destiny iconography that a lot of you have probably seen even if you've never played the game. These little polygon guys that act as companions and helpers to the player character. This is the event that brought them into being. Ghosts are fragments of the Traveler, children of the Traveler. You can think of them in a couple different ways, but regardless, they are the defense system that the Traveler put in place while it slumbered. Each ghost is born with a partner. Or, no, maybe that's not the best way to describe it. Maybe I should say, each ghost is born to bring their partner to life. Now we're going to start getting into the power systems again. Each ghost is brought into being with a specific partner in mind. However, that partner is dead, and the ghost doesn't know where they are. Ghosts have to individually find their partner by searching across the ruins of the solar system. This is not always a quick process. It can take a while, but the timescale of the Destiny universe is centuries at the short end, so it's just the way that things are. When a ghost finds even a tiny remnant of their designated partner, even a single bone, they will use the power of the light to restore them to form, albeit without any of the person's memories. This is very important. People revived by ghosts do not have memory of their past life. We will get into why that is later when we talk about the symbolism of these powers. These chosen people have gone by many names over the centuries. Originally, they were simply called the Risen, but in the present day of the game, they are known as Guardians. Finally, about half an hour into this video, we have reached the player character of the game. Guardians have the very rare distinction of being able to wield the light directly, which means we've reached the promised part of the video where I explain how exactly the light functions in the hands of a mortal. I mean, kind of, as best I can. Because of the way the light works, saying how exactly it works is technically impossible. Let me explain. If you'll recall the beginning of the video, light is cosmic complexity roughly shaped into a force, and that force exists outside of and above conventional rules of the universe and the laws of physics. The entire conceit of the light, and the darkness too for that matter, is that they don't play by the rules, and were made to fly in the face of those rules. That's their whole thing. In fact, Destiny has actively made a point to give a middle finger to power scalers multiple times. Let me read you a section of in-game lore coming from one of the universe's most knowledgeable scholars. It says, quote, "Guardians insist on treating power as a monotonically increasing value with a single dimension. Guardians will casually create ordinal ranks of this power of their comrades when, in truth, light is not only a multi-factor landscape, but strongly and stochastically influenced by circumstantial, personal, and esoteric variables. Light is not constrained by facts." This is a very complex, sort of academic way of phrasing everything, but there's another lore entry that puts it a lot more succinctly. Technically, this is describing the darkness, but in this area, the two work the same way. A villain of the game named Xivu Arath has described it as such. "This power may cause two different numbers to become equal." At this point, hopefully my telling science to go fuck itself comment from earlier makes a lot more sense, because that is almost literally what users of the light and darkness do. They look at the rules of nature and physics and the natural world and say, no, I want them to work this way, and by the power of light or darkness, I'm gonna make that happen. In this manner, the magic system of Destiny kind of runs on reality warping, though this does not mean that any Guardian can do anything that they want. Light and darkness still manifest in forms that are similar to energy, and so the bigger change you want to make, the more energy you're going to need to pull that off. This light energy still comes from the Traveler. While a Guardian can wield light, they do not generate it within themselves. This system happens through the Traveler and the Guardian and their ghost, and I would actually compare it shockingly closely to Green Lantern for those who are comics people. The Guardian is comparable to a lantern ring. They have a set amount of energy held within themselves that they can use for a variety of effects, but that energy will eventually run out. The Traveler is still their ultimate source of life. The magical aura of this sleeping god is where Guardians draw their power from, but not directly. That is done through a middleman, which is the Ghost. To continue the Green Lantern comparison, God, I hope most people watching this video have at least a passing familiarity with Green Lantern. If the Traveler is the central battery, then the Ghosts are the personal batteries. It's a three-stage system. The Traveler passively emits light, and then the Ghosts, as fragments of the Traveler, can channel that light wherever they are in the universe, funneling it into their Guardian, basically acting like a battery charger. Then from there, the Guardian can manifest that light as tools or weapons. This makes the Ghost vital to Guardians as a concept, and their importance does not end there. Ghosts are individually sapient beings. They all have their own likes, dislikes, and personalities, so they can act as a companion to a Guardian while also being like a little AI. They can scan and process things with incredible speed. And, maybe the biggest thing about Guardian powers, the presence of their ghost makes a Guardian functionally immortal, because the process used to revive a Guardian the first time can be repeated as many times as that Guardian needs. See, Destiny does something that I love to see video games do, which is integrate the in-game revival mechanic with the lore itself. When you're playing Destiny and your Guardian is killed and then comes back 5 seconds later, that is because they actually died in the story, and the ghost brought them back. Every death is canon. Fortunately, Guardians do not lose their memories on these subsequent revivals. The amnesia only happens when they first become a Guardian, which means that Guardians can die and come back as many times as needed, even by choice if they want. There is a faction of Guardians called the Thanatonauts who seek to understand death by just doing it as many times as they can until they eventually gain knowledge of what's really going on there. This revival happens quick, but it is not automatic. It can be triggered at the discretion of the ghost, which means it can be used as a tactical move. There is a story of a very important Guardian named Rezel Azir who coordinated a plan with his ghost ahead of a fight and then let himself die to a much larger opponent. When that foe raised the corpse of the Guardian in victory, then the ghost triggered the revival, and the newly alive Rezel blew his enemy's head off from that position. This is also a great point for me to mention. Guardians are scary as hell. See, if you're a typical citizen of Earth, then Guardians are amazing. They're basically like demigods, incredibly powerful warriors so infused with the light of the Traveler that not even death can keep them down. But if you are not under the protection of the Guardians, like, most of the universe, then those immortal warriors seem less like superheroes and more like terrifying reality-warping cosmic zombies that you cannot kill no matter how hard you try. This is not me saying implication either. This is a part of the lore. Guardians are terrifying. In some alien cultures, they are literally ghost stories, spooky tales told around the campfire to scare children. Despite all their cosmic might, though, Guardians can technically be killed, it's just that they have a very specific weak point. Technically not in the Guardian themselves, the weak point is the ghost. Ghosts are resilient, but not invincible. Their light can be overwhelmed by a stronger source of darkness, and they can also simply break, though that requires quite a heavy blow. For this reason, they usually stay hidden beneath the armor of their Guardian, but they do need to show themselves to trigger a revival. So if you can manipulate the situation well enough, you can bait a ghost out and then take it down. However, this is risky. Very, very, very risky. Ultimately, you want to be 100% certain that Guardian is dead when you kill the ghost, or you're going to have a bad time. See, Guardians know all of this stuff. The ghosts are their constant companions. They're aware of how this system works. And if you take out a ghost while the Guardian is alive, sure, their next death will be their final one, but they're not rendered immediately powerless. Remember, the Guardians are like batteries and ghosts are their chargers. Whatever light they had in their system when their ghost was killed, they still have. So sure, say you're an evil darkness alien and you managed to kill a ghost. That's great. But previously, you were fighting an already very powerful cosmic reality warping super warrior. And now you're facing a powerful cosmic reality warping super warrior who knows their life has a countdown on it, has nothing else to lose, and also you just murdered their best friend. So unless you have a great plan of how to finish this conflict, nobody's going home. This is somehow made even worse by the fact that Guardians, at least a lot of Guardians, are kind of canonically insane. This is due to another fun little way that Destiny has weaved the fact that it is a video game into the lore. Much of the player behavior is also a thing in-universe. While most Guardians, though certainly not all, are good guys who want to protect humanity, they have a tendency to be violent and sociopathic. Guardians are, at the end of the day, nigh immortal super beings with no memories of their past lives tying them down to reality. They enjoy the fighting, they enjoy the violence, they enjoy getting loot and new weapons and spoils of victory. And this can cause problems. This provides a great transition back to the timeline, though we will return to some mechanics of the light and darkness a bit later. Remember, guardians and ghosts were created long before the events of the game itself, and those first few centuries were difficult. I have often described the setting of Destiny to my friends as post-apocalypse. The world that we play in is a world that has been destroyed, but then recovered. This does mean that there was a post-apocalypse period, though. The time after the collapse is simply called the Dark Ages, and it mostly resembles what you would expect from a sci-fi post-apocalypse thing. Most information and infrastructure has been lost or destroyed, and so roaming bands of survivors try to make an existence for themselves in a world that no longer suits them. It is pretty normal for the genre. Except for, the amnesiac battle wizards running around. Guardians, known as the Risen during this time, were the nearly uncontested rulers throughout the entire Dark Age. Many of them became powerful warlords, some protecting the people in their charge, others less so. As more ghosts eventually found their partners and more Risen were brought back to life, they eventually began coming into conflict, escalated further by the arrival of other alien forces in the Sol system. As I've already said, I'm going to be covering the specifics of most of Destiny's alien species in their own dedicated videos, but in a general sense, this is when most of them started showing up on Earth, usually in search of the Traveler. After all, this was the longest it had ever remained in a single location, and that came with a promise of great power for the taking. Much like the Golden Age, the Dark Age is a very long stretch of time, and too much happens in here for me to quickly summarize in this rough timeline. Though I should note, this is the point where notable NPCs and characters from Destiny get their start. Guardians don't really age, so even though this was centuries before the present, some notable warlords are still around. Lord Shaxx, for example, was a warlord during the Dark Age, though thankfully he was one of the more responsible ones, which is why he integrated with the city later. And speaking of that, the City Age is the next major shift in the timeline. The city, sometimes referred to as the Last City, doesn't really have a name outside of that, but the Last City summarizes its concept pretty well. Many settlements rose and fell during the Dark Age, but the one that would have the longest legacy is, unsurprisingly, a civilization built in the shadow of the Traveler. This made it very easy to find and better protected, as well as just being a symbolic place for humanity to regain their start. Also, for those curious, the real-world location of the city has never been officially nailed down, though there are many fan theories about it. Personally, the one I find most convincing places it in southwestern Canada or the United States Pacific Northwest, somewhere in that general region, though there are a lot of other places speculated. At the time of the game, the city is a sprawling metropolis protected by a massive wall alongside its borders, though it took a very long time to get to this state. Given how much change happens during the City Age, I wouldn't be surprised if we eventually got a game set there if Sony and Bungie decide to make more Destiny media. A single-player story game set during the early City Age would be really cool. And that's all I'm going to say about the City Age for now during this quick timeline, though as you should all probably know by now based on how many times I've said it, I will be returning to points in this period in future videos. Now, finally, we are at the actual time of Destiny's in-game events. But before I talk about those, I can sidebar and talk a little more on Guardian structure and mechanics of how the powers work. In the mechanics of Destiny as a game, Guardians are divided into three classes. Hunters, which are essentially rangers and rogues, Titans, which are essentially barbarians and fighters, and Warlocks, which are... these classes are mostly for game mechanics, but they do exist in the lore as well. In-universe, these classifications are self-imposed. They are a way to give structure to Guardians as a fighting force, but not every Guardian technically has to be a Hunter, Titan, or Warlock. Actually, to extend that out for a minute, not every light bearer has to be a guardian. Technically, guardian is specifically a term for people risen by ghosts with light that protect the last city. But there are guardians who decide not to do that and go off to do their own thing. These are typically just called light bearers in a general sense. The Guardians are overseen by the Vanguard, 3 people who are the pinnacle of their respective classes, plus a very large supporting staff, of course. Many people have held these positions over the history of the world, but the ones that we see in the game itself are Commander Zavala as the Titan Vanguard, Ikora Rey as the Warlock Vanguard, and originally Cade 6 as the Hunter Vanguard, though he would die over one of the game's expansions and be replaced by Crow, who is complicated and will get his own section later. The control and capability of the Vanguard has risen and fallen over the years. In fact, especially in the later years of Destiny 2, there was a subtle B-plot happening regarding exactly that, to such an extent that I would say if and when we get a Destiny 3, I would bet money on the Vanguard crumbling pretty early into its timeline. This would be pretty catastrophic for the people of the city, as the Vanguard is one of the few things holding the many insane Guardians in check. The Vanguard oversees missions and operations, they house many Guardians as well as providing much of their gear, and they also train new Guardians, as light powers do require training and practice to hone. And look at that, now we've looped back around to the nature of the light and its foundation as a reality warping power. This is one of the major cases in which Destiny as a game and Destiny as lore diverge, which is bound to happen. Video games need structured mechanics after all. In the game, light powers are divided very nicely into neat little categories. You have your grenade powers, your melee powers, warlocks can put healing rifts on the ground, titans can make energy barricades, and everybody has their super abilities where they can let their light loose and go crazy. In lore terms, the distinctions are not this clear. Light powers do not operate like Dungeons & Dragons spells, for example. You do not have a certain spell that always triggers a certain thing, like pushing a button on a controller does. I think a better comparison is actually bending from The Last Airbender. Light is a force that can be manipulated, and actually it does manifest in the form of elements, which I'll talk about in just a second. You can replicate certain moves or abilities, but these are techniques, not spells. Light lets you warp the laws of reality to your own ends, and since the goal of this is quite literally complexity as a concept, it is very open-ended. If you have enough light at your disposal, you can manipulate things in whatever way you can think of. Of course, you can train this to other people. If one Guardian comes up with a really cool way to make a light attack, this can then be taught to others. You see where the bending comparison comes in. Most Guardians will use abilities very similar to the ones that you see in-game, because most Guardians are ultimately standard and are going to use the training provided to them, but particularly intelligent, creative, and/or reckless Guardians might do a lot more. By extension, this also means that the pinnacle of Guardian power is way higher than we see in-game. There is a story in which a very strong warlock named Osiris uses 4 of the game's super abilities in the span of maybe a minute and a half. The other way that the game tries to boil this system down to a mechanic that you can actually play is through the classification of elements. Now, mix and matching playable elements was something that the game introduced in the later years, but for much of the run, Guardians would pick one element of light, and that is what they would use for everything all the time. This is of course not how it works in lore. Guardians can mix and match elements whenever they choose based on their preferences and what they have or have not learned. So let's go into those elements. Light can theoretically form into a bunch of different elements, but the 3 that we wield in the game are solar, arc, and void. In simple terms, fire, lightning, gravity. But I think you've probably gotten the idea by now that the power system of Destiny is very weird and conceptual and philosophical, so there are many, many more layers to this. Each element in Destiny actually has 3 meanings behind it. A literal surface level one that dives a little bit more into the science backing this world, and then a philosophical one. I'm going to start with Arc because I think the comparisons there are the most clear. The surface level expression of arc is, as I mentioned, lightning. I don't have anything else to say about that, let's just move on. Here's where things get a little bit more complicated immediately. By manipulating arc, Guardians are not technically wielding lightning. Lightning is not a rule of the universe, not at a fundamental level. And remember, that's what the light does. It takes the rules of the universe and the laws of physics and makes them work differently. What arc actually is at a deeper level is tied to electromagnetism. When a Guardian points a hand at something they want to blow up and shoots a big ol' lightning bolt at it, they aren't just shooting a lightning bolt at it. What they're actually doing is altering the laws of electromagnetism on a very tiny localized scale to briefly shift things enough that a lightning bolt manifests where they want it to. Now, technically, in a way, I suppose that Guardians really are just pointing their hand at something and shooting a lightning bolt at it, because wielding the light does not require conscious understanding of the forces you are manipulating. It can help, and many Guardians do study that, but it is not necessary for the process. Remember, it's all about telling science to go fuck itself. The light can handle the specifics, it is about bending the universe to your will. Your will says lightning, and the light provides. This leads nicely into the third meaning of arc, the more philosophical one. What arc represents beyond the laws of science is motion and change. The light predates physics. The light even predates the basic order of cause and effect. In fact, the term paracausal is often used to describe the light and its related forces. You don't have to worry about the mechanics because what matters is the meaning. So on the deepest level, when a Guardian points their hand at something and shoots a lightning bolt at it, they are willing movement, motion, change, a spark, a bolt, and the light within them alters the cause and effect that came after it to make the universe suit that whim. It's weird, but I think I explained that well enough. So that's arc, the element of motion. Now let's move on to void, which at its highest level is the element of gravity. Then at its middle level, it is still kind of gravity. Actually, gravity is weird, man. In terms of pop culture and superpowers, gravity is often represented as telekinesis, but more specific. But what gravity actually is a very, very complex piece of an even more complex system of space-time, and that is the more physics-based thing that the second layer of void manipulates. Then the philosophical layer of void is actually described, I think, pretty perfectly in an in-game line, so I'm just gonna quote that exactly instead of paraphrasing. The void shows that emptiness is not necessarily nothingness, allowing users to draw power from both the immeasurably small and the unfathomably massive. It revolves around the idea that the universe is far more than we can perceive at any given time. Below us in scale, there are countless interactions between atoms, and above us in scale, there are countless interactions between celestial bodies. Void represents this invisible push and pull that governs the flow of the universe. It is kind of similar to arc as motion at base concept, but remember that the light represents complexity, so all of these elements are going to be related to movement in one way or another. Arc is a more direct, present, immediate motion, whereas void is a slow shifting. Then finally, we have solar, which at a surface level is fire, and at a secondary level is heat, which again sounds kind of similar, but physics people will agree that heat as a concept is very different than fire in general. Then reaching the philosophical, this represents heat as a catalyst for change. Heat is a force that humans use all the time to alter the state of things in varying ways. You can burn something down with a fire, but you can also cook something for a more positive effect. Thus, this element represents heat as a breakdown, but not a breakdown for a simplification. That would be a darkness power. Solar energy is about the breakdown of things leading to something new in the aftermath. And while I'm talking about the elements of light, I might as well spend some time on the elements of darkness. I'm getting ahead of myself in the timeline a little bit here, but over the course of the game, Guardians began to wield darkness as well as light, and these darkness powers also were split into subclass elements for gameplay purposes. While these are tied to philosophy of simplicity rather than complexity, darkness elements follow the same three-tiered structure, which is why it is simplest for me to explain them in the same section. The first darkness element in the game is stasis. The surface level manifestation is ice, and the second level manifestation is the halting of movement at a molecular and quantum level. While they look like regular ice, what stasis crystals are described as in lore is basically a guardian using darkness to slow molecules down to such a degree that they eventually stop and naturally arrange themselves into a perfectly stable crystalline structure that can then be manipulated, kind of like ice. I don't know how logical this is in terms of real-world physics, but also, the darkness doesn't have to follow logic. It spits in the face of it, so sure, that makes enough sense in context. The philosophical layer of this one is maybe obvious already, because I just said that stasis arranges molecules into perfectly stable structures. That is kind of the darkness's whole thing. It wants perfect stability and simplicity, and stasis is a literal manifestation of that. More specifically though, stasis is also the element of control, using your will to halt actions that displease you. If there is a movement or a complexity that you disapprove of, stasis is how you can force it to stop. Then the next darkness element is strand. This one is really weird, I'm not gonna lie. To sort of pull back the curtain for a moment, it is very, very, very highly speculated that there were a lot of production issues regarding Strand in the game development pipeline, and that led to the lore and release of it getting a little muddled, but I will do my best. The physical manifestation of Strand is like strings and webbing. I know this sounds kind of weird when all the others were very obvious physical things, but Strand is basically the bug type of Destiny. It also has less of a second physics-based layer at all, because while the physical manifestation of Strand is very clearly bug type stuff, the meaning underlying that is psychic type. Yes, I'm just using Pokemon terms now, I don't care, it is the best analogy that I can think of. Strand is described at its more deep layers as a web of consciousness made into physical material. Before the introduction of Strand, psychic powers had never been a huge element in the Destiny universe outside of some general prophecies and clairvoyant visions. But yeah, when Strand was added to the game, they kind of just established that all minds are connected by this sort of invisible psychic plane, and using the power of Strand, you can pull that material out and make it real and use it to attack people. There are more layers and concepts buried beneath Strand that I could go into, but it would take me a very long time to piece it out, and I'm trying to keep this section relatively quick, so screw it, I'm going to leave it there. Strand is a sort of psychic element representing connection not between physical things, but between minds. And the third playable darkness power doesn't actually exist. It is almost certain that the developers were going to add one in the future, but unfortunately Destiny 2 came to the end of its life before we ever saw what that was. So at the end, there were only 5 elements, though more do exist in the lore if not the mechanics. I'll keep this brief because it is my theories and not officially canon lore or information, but I am pretty sure I know what the third darkness element was going to be, and so I do want to say it. I would bet it is this thing called resonance. Resonance is an established power in the lore of the game, and it is actually something that I would call a darkness element. It is something that exists even if we never got to play as it. Resonance is the darkness manifested in waves or sound. If I had to take a stab at the philosophical meaning of resonance, I would guess that it is the element of communication, information simplified into a waveform that can be transmitted. This tracks with symbolism too, because the most frequent user of resonance is the witness themselves and their direct underlings. The Witness is a cult leader, after all, stringing its followers along with pretty words and promises, so it literally using information and communication as a weapon would pair really well with the themes. Also, Resonance has a really unique visual identity within the game, with these black, blocky geometric shapes surrounded by this golden aura, and that specific gold is very distinct from any colors of elements that the players get to use, so I bet it was chosen to eventually be playable. This is, of course, just my theory. I have no solid evidence that Resonance was ever meant for the Guardians, and there are other candidates. Darkness has also manifested in the red Nightmare power, which seems to represent fear and instinct. We also could have gotten that. Honestly, I bet both of them were at some point tested. This further goes to prove that the Garden forces are way more complex than we usually see. Over the course of Destiny, people wielding both the light and the darkness have used powers that don't fit any of the established elements. Much like Guardian classes, these elements exist in lore, but as a framework of techniques, and there is a lot more beyond them. I've just about covered all the primary manifestations of light and darkness though, so we'll leave that there. There is technically one more element of how they function, but that is best saved for the end of the video, so first let's go back to the timeline once more. Where we last left this off, we'd reached the game, the events of the Destiny universe that you can actually play. Now, because this video series is going to be focusing more on lore and world building of the Destiny universe, I'm not going to be giving a fully detailed timeline of the in-game events. If you want one of those, I know another YouTuber just recently made one, and his video is over 10 hours long. God damn, and I thought my stuff was long. Mad respect, my guy. For those who do not have a full 10 hours to spare, I will be talking about a lot of in-game events in this series, but in the videos on the factions involved in them, and I will give a broad strokes summary right now. What the first 10 years of the Destiny franchise revolved around was the return of the Witness. When the Traveler sacrificed itself during the collapse, the Witness was not killed, they were just thrown to the far reaches of space, and since the Traveler was their ultimate singular goal, they were inevitably going to come back for it. Now, I won't pretend that Destiny did not have a substantial amount of retcons and obvious direction shifts during the 10-year Light and Darkness saga, but by the end of it, in the Final Shape expansion, this is where things had landed. After the original decade-long story concluded, there was also a kind of awkward 2-year period during which Bungie tried and failed to launch a new decade-long story called the Fate Saga. I will be talking about some elements of the Fate Saga in the last video of this series, but since it is unfinished and we don't know if it ever will be finished, I'm not going to go into huge detail, because I don't have details. Returning to things I do know, over the course of Destiny, most, though not all enemy factions were servants and or victims of the Witness. There were 7 enemy factions in total, 4 of which were individual species, and 3 of which were offshoots. The most Witness-aligned faction is the Hive, a species of alien insectoids that are fused with the darkness on a biological level. They are obsessed with death and tied to it intrinsically. If the Hive do not kill, they die. Hive lore also happens to be some of my favorite sci-fantasy writing ever, not just in terms of Destiny, like of all time. I am very excited for the Hive video I'm going to be making for release later this week. On the far other side of the spectrum from the Hive, we have the Elixni, better known in the earlier years of Destiny as the Fallen. They were so named because their civilization was one destroyed by the Witness after the Traveler abandoned them in that cycle that kept happening before the events of the game. While the Hive are pretty unambiguously evil horror death monsters, the Elixni are a lot more morally gray. Most of their species is not intrinsically evil, they are just refugees, doing what they have to survive after the loss of their homeworld and most of their people. Many Elixni did choose violence and became pirates or raiders, but some of them chose cooperation, and by the end of Destiny, there were Elixni living alongside humans in the city. This was a great story to watch play out, and it's another one I'm very excited to tell. Third, we have the Cabal, a name not for an individual species, but an empire that spanned several different races. The main race, the one that started all the conquering, is known as the Barent, and they are very heavily influenced by the real-world Roman Empire aesthetically, as you can tell by their everything. In the current state of Destiny, most Cabal are allies of the city as well, because the Guardian killed a couple of their emperors, and eventually one rose to power who was less awful than all the previous ones, so now they're our buddies. Finally, for the core species, there is the Vex, and oh god, how do I explain the Vex succinctly? Screw it, I'm just gonna go with this. The Vex are time-traveling robots, except they cannot actually time travel, and also are not actually robots. And you're just gonna have to wait for the dedicated Vex video to figure out what I mean by that. Then we have the three offshoot enemy factions, which are, to put it as simply as I possibly can, cosmic horror zombies in 3 different flavors. These entities are all existing beings who have been forcibly converted into new forms through application of different paracausal forces. They consist of the Taken, the Scorn, and the Dread. The Taken are created through application of very specific and difficult darkness techniques, resulting in a sort of spell that allows the wielder to rip somebody out of the physical plane, thrust them into another dimension for a bit, and in that other dimension, strengthen them while also stripping away their free will and binding them to the Taker's service. The Scorn are more specific. Taken can be made out of anything, but Scorn are specifically zombie elixni, created because somebody made a wish on a magic dragon. Yeah, Destiny has magic dragons, and they are ultimately less relevant than you would expect magic dragons to be, but we'll get to them later. Finally, there is the Dread. The Dread are more specific not because of what they used to be, but because of who makes them. The Dread are monsters specifically reshaped by the power of the Witness. The Witness can recruit disciples and minions from all over the universe, but the Dread are kind of like their royal guard, specifically designed for high-value positions. Beyond this, we don't know a lot about these things, though. The Dread were only introduced alongside the Witness's return in the last chapter of that saga, so they weren't important for very long. The eventual defeat of the Witness that concluded the saga came through a couple of factors. First off, Guardians were able to exploit a fundamental weakness in the Witness's nature: dissenters. If you'll recall, the Witness is composed of the entire precursor race, even those who did not want to be assimilated and did not agree with the mission of the final shape. So, through a very careful application of paracausal powers, some Guardians were able to enter the Witness's mind and embolden these dissenters, creating cracks in the cohesion that let the Witness be as strong as it was. From there, it was basically Destiny's Avengers Endgame moment, with the Witness fragmenting, a decade's worth of hard-won allies united to kick its ass and blow it up, and I use singular pronouns there very intentionally. The Witness, as literally multiple entities, was always referred to in plural. They called themselves we. That is, up until their final moments, when, with consciousness shattered, the Witness uttered its last words, "I don't understand." A beautiful ending to this saga, so much symbolism packed into that tiny little phrase, I love it so much. Now, the defeat of the Witness, as cool as it was not achieved just through overwhelming might. It was the culmination of an arc that had been happening for several years in the game, which is the Guardians mastering darkness as well as light. Remember that light and darkness are not good and evil. They are complexity and simplicity, and neither of those things have an inherent morality to them. If light ruled unchallenged across the universe, then the universe would be infinite chaos. Nothing would ever remain, everything would be constantly growing and changing, and that would not be a very pleasant reality to exist in. But if darkness ruled unchallenged across everything, then there wouldn't really be an everything. It would just be one infinite plane of similarity, as simple as things can get, which is basically nothing. Ooh, wow, balance between opposing cosmic forces in a magic system, what a revolutionary idea. But bear with me for a second, because Destiny genuinely took this concept in a way that I've never seen any media do before, and it's really interesting. In the universe of Destiny, perfect balance is also a bad thing. Ultimately, that is what the Witness was trying to achieve in some form. The final shape was balance, but it was the universe balanced into a perfect pattern. There was no freedom there was only control. The final shape is not paradise, it's a trap. It is just as confining as ultimate light or ultimate darkness would be. And that means that the real goal is the conflict. There is a core theme of Destiny, perhaps the most important theme of the whole series, something that has been present throughout this entire video, but that I also have not drawn attention to until now. The theme of Destiny is free will. Destiny occupies a very, very tiny subgenre of media, but one that is also maybe my favorite of all time. I don't know if there's technically a name for this, but I refer to it as eldritch cosmic Lovecraftian horror viewed through an optimistic lens instead of a nihilistic one. Destiny says that the world is terrifying and complicated and beyond anything that humans could hope to understand. But nevertheless, humans exist. We might not understand our existence, but we have it, and we get to choose what we do with that life. And now let's go back to the power system. I know this seems like a weird way to go back to the mechanics of the magic, but trust me, this is going to make sense, because there's another layer of light and darkness thematically that I haven't addressed either. When a Guardian is revived, they have no memories of their past life. This seems like a tiny detail, maybe something to facilitate the story of the video game, and in a way it is that, but it is also a fundamental element of this game's entire philosophy. Light forgets. Complexity as a concept is not rooted in the past, it is rooted in the future, moving forward, growing, changing, and becoming something new, and Guardians are stripped of their past lives so that they can do exactly that. Every Guardian is a new person, bringing new complexity to the universe through whatever choices they make from that point on. This can be a great kindness. In forgetting, there is forgiveness, there is freedom from past trauma, but there are also negatives to this. To forget, you open yourself to weakness. You have to know those who have hurt you in the past so that you can be prepared to defend from them in the future. And this is where the opposing force comes in, because darkness remembers. Simplicity needs to remember. It has to learn everything that's already happened so that it can be prepared for the future. It has to understand complexity that came before it so that change can be counteracted. In this way, darkness can provide incredible strength, but it can also make somebody jaded, paranoid, and cruel, always looking back and worrying about the future instead of taking movements towards it. And sure, you can try and balance these two forces, but that's also not realistic. Destiny does not pretend that some perfect karmic balance exists between the light and darkness. That is not something that humans can achieve. Some people are going to lean more into the light, others are going to lean more into the darkness. That's just the nature of existence, and humans, in this insane universe of ours, have the freedom to choose. This incredible core philosophy is something I will be returning to in probably every video I make in this little Destiny series, but to wrap it up very nicely in one singular sentence: light forgets, darkness remembers, and Guardians make their own fate. Thank you all so much for watching the first episode of my Destiny Week mini-series. As always, I do hope you enjoyed, especially because there are 6 more of them coming. By the time you are watching this video, most if not all of them have already been completed. As I mentioned way back at the beginning, my videos on this topic are kind of designed as an intro course. They are mostly for people who did not know what Destiny was all about and want to learn, so it hits things very quickly and at a high level. If you would like to know more details, check out My Name is Bife, also here on YouTube. This guy is like probably the best Destiny lore knower in the world. Anything that I talk about in these videos, Bife has gone into many times more detail on and discussed a lot more of the tiny details and nuances, because this is the guy's whole career. He is to Destiny what I like to think of myself as to Marvel Comics. Speaking of which, if you happened to stumble upon my channel because of this Destiny video, first off, hello, and secondly, I am mostly a Marvel guy. I will touch on other topics as the interest strikes me, but Marvel is my main area of expertise, so subscribe if you want to see more of that. Speaking of subscribing to things, I have a Patreon. If you go and check that out, you can get early and ad-free access to all of my videos, as well as an exclusive video every month. There's like 9 hours of exclusive content on there and counting. My username there is the exact same as it is here. There's also a link to that in the description of this video and on my channel page, so it's very easy to find. And extra double thank you to everyone who already supports me over there. It really does help me keep making these videos for you guys. Last shout out to Ruben Perez, the artist I work with for these videos. He drew the poses of the character that's been talking at you for the last hour or so go check out his other work if you have a chance. And now, I have, like, 6 more Destiny videos to make. Recording on this one is done, but that is step 1 of 20-something. By the time you watch this video, I am going to be so exhausted, but I think it will have been worth it.